Welcome. Thank you guys all for coming today. This is just, we're so excited to be here in Fairfield. Our program has expanded in Fairfield, and David Shaw's here to launch our program here. My name's Nicole Newell. I'm the Sustainable Landscape Program Manager for Sustainable Solano. And I want to give you a little bit of history behind our organization. So we started out as Benicia Community Garden, and in 2014, when California entered a drought, we were looking for a way to be more efficient with water. And so we found permaculture. And so permaculture is a way of designing working with nature. So we installed 7 demonstration food forests in Benicia, and there was such a huge water savings that Solano County Water Agency asked us to expand that program all of Solano County. So we've installed 2 private residence food forests in Vallejo, and now we're coming into Fairfield. So the application process is open to Fairfield homeowners. And what is a food forest, right? So it's, I always like to think of it as a community of diverse plants that work together to benefit each other. And a big part of the food forest is utilizing secondary water. We do laundry to landscape gray water systems, and diverting roof water into ditches called swales. So that's 2 ways that we utilize secondary water. And so that's kind of the foundation of what a food forest is. And these are workshops that are open to the public. So the food forest keepers open their home to community workshops, and they get this beautiful garden installed, and through that process, people are volunteering. They're calling their friends and family to help. So people are learning how to install this while while then a home gets this gorgeous food forest. So now, so this is open to Fairfield, and I saw David Shaw speak in Benicia, which was just such a treat, and he does everything. He's just a whole system thinker, permaculture designer, facilitator, educator. I mean, has 2 permaculture centers that he's founded, and but what impressed me the most about him is he really comes from a heart, and he's a real human being. So I just want to introduce David Shaw, and thank you so much for being here, and welcome.
Yeah, right on. And I brought my guitar at your request.
I know.
Not here, but great. Well, thanks everybody for being here today. I know that there's a lot of things you could be doing with your time today in particular, so I want to honor you for choosing to be here. So I'm David Shaw from Santa Cruz. I founded Santa Cruz Permaculture about 2 years ago, though I've been teaching permaculture for over 10 years now. I also founded and run the UC Santa Cruz Common Ground Center at Kresge College, which is also a permaculture-infused center. So if you want to go to college in a little bit, come on up to Santa Cruz, or down to Santa Cruz. And you're all welcome. We have free public events all the time. It's only, about 2 hours away from here, so fairly close. We're neighbors on opposite sides of the bay. And so the stories I'm going to share today kind of move through 3 parts. One is covering the basics, just defining what permaculture is and going over some of the key concepts, the theory, if you will. And then 2 is showing the on-the-ground examples, really, getting excited about how permaculture is applied in various parts of the world. And then 3, I was asked to go big picture, and I tend to kind of go back and forth between the details and the big patterns. And so at the end, I wanted just to talk globally about collaboration and about sort of the state of the world as I see it. So here we go. And I think I have to click over here first. All right. So let's go back actually to that first slide. You might wonder why I'm saying beyond sustainability, because sustainability is, such a common term. It's even maybe a little greenwashed and turning into a buzzword. And the reason I'm saying that is because, one, given the state of the world, what are we sustaining right now? Are we sustaining the status quo, especially with what's happening in Charlottesville and with the sort of rise of white supremacy here? What are we really wanting to sustain? In fact, I would say we're needing to consciously choose healing. We're needing to actually go out of our way in many cases and regenerate and restore damaged social systems, damaged political systems, damaged ecological systems. They're really all connected because that's how systems work, right? It's like a spider web. You pull on one string and everything else moves. Yeah, what are we really sustaining? Are we sustaining the status quo? And then also we need to choose this ethic of healing, or what I like to say is libdify, which is leave it better than you found it, right? Turning that into an acronym. We need to libdify the world. And so here's just a basic concept of degenerative, generative, or sustainable and regenerative systems. And this comes from an article about community resilience. So, you can see the system coming in, and then there's a shock that happens. Could be a natural catastrophe, could be a man-made catastrophe, some act, affecting a community. Things are in chaos for a moment, and we have a choice. It's like Hurricane Katrina right there. How do we want to rebuild? Do we want to just kind of let things slowly recover on their own? Might take a little while, might be a little degenerative. Do we want to get back to where we were, or can we leave it better than we found it? Can we make it regenerative? I think of degenerative systems as like a car. A car's always going to need a new oil change, new tires. It's kind of always going to be aging. Sustainable or generative is really good. It's like 100%, stuff made from 100% recycled material. But that material cannot be 100% recycled. Typically, it kind of downgrades over time. And furthermore, those recycled products don't improve the factories that they were built in. So oftentimes when we look at sustainable solutions, they're actually kind of degenerative. So we can go the extra step towards regenerative systems, which are, again, leaving it better than we found it. Any system that is creating soil carbon is going to be regenerative because it's going to be constantly sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and sinking it into the organic matter in the soil. Another example is in a riparian corridor, in a watershed, along a creek, you can take rocks and pile them up in a certain way to make a little tiny check dam. And as the water rushes down that creek, it'll slow down, spread out, and sink into that into the groundwater right there, and over time that'll raise the water table so that the stream will run more. So that's a regenerative solution. Every time it rains, instead of washing away soil and silt and everything, it's actually sinking in right there and thus raising the water table. So another way you could think about this is when you're talking about your partnership or your marriage, is your marriage sustainable or is it regenerative? If you think about it. Oh yeah, we're getting by, it's doing good, we're still there, still together. Versus like, we're going to new places every time we meet and, things are growing. And so, I think that's a good example of how we can move beyond sustainability. So another critical aspect of permaculture is around not waiting anymore. Permaculture was started in the late 1970s in Australia by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. They coined the term, and it's permanent culture and permanent agriculture at the same time. And they basically said, the political systems and the economic systems of today, they may be with us, they may be against us, but they're inadequate. And we need to just not wait any longer. And just get to work. So it's kind of an anarchist route, you could say, but it's to say that we need to take responsibility for our own lives and that of the future generations and not rely on anybody else to take that responsibility for us. You could also refer to Margaret Mead, the anthropologist's famous quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." I like to think about the power of conversation in that same way. Or if you think about things in the world, everything starts as a conversation, as an idea, right? Everything we've ever created as a species has started as a conversation. And I think of an idea and I say, hey, Christine, what do you think about this idea I have? You're like, oh my God, that's such a good idea. Can you tweak it in this way that might make it a little bit better? We start designing together, and then it's good enough, then we go out and build it. So it's small groups of people having conversations around what really matters to them that then take collective action that changes the world, I believe. So, okay, now the basic theory of permaculture. So as I said, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren sort of coined this term. They very much open sourced it from the get-go, so a lot of permaculture curriculum and videos and whatnot are all free and online and accessible. And they were researching patterns worldwide of communities that had good land stewardship and were durable and resilient and long-lasting in their land base, but also politically had governance structures that allowed for peace and economic prosperity. And they were looking worldwide. And so what they found is that every society they looked at that was durable and resilient on their land base had a moral framework. There's a basic ethical foundation to their society. And they distilled it to these three ethics: earth care, people care, fair share. So earth care, kind of obvious. People care, also kind of obvious. But just to expand on that a little bit, what's good for the earth is good for the people. What's good for the people is good for the earth. What's bad for the earth is bad for the people, and what's bad for the people is bad for the earth. It's that basic principle or indigenous wisdom that all of our ancestors have at one point in time that says we are nature. This whole separation of humans from the natural world that came about with industrialization and that, man specifically will dominate nature, it's just so false and artificial. We have evolved to be to fulfill our ecological niche just in the same way an oak tree has evolved to fulfill its ecological niche in, similar yet different ways. So that's the first two ethics. The last one, fair share, is a little trickier, as you can imagine. So fair share is that economic aspect of things, the fair share of the pie, as the icon will show. And that's about setting limits to wasteful growth and overpopulation and redistributing the surplus. So we want to design systems that are overabundant, design gardens that are overabundant and produce more food than we need so that we can return it into the system for other life. Again, leave it better than you found it. Not just trying to grow enough just for me and just for us, but actually more than enough. And if you think about it from a farmer's perspective, crop failure is a very real thing. It's good to overproduce. Like when we're crop planting on production farms, I work at the UCSC Farm and Garden quite a bit, and when we sow seeds and we need 100 plants, we sow 120 plants, and when we need, or let's say we sow 140 plants, and then we plant out 120 of them, and then we harvest from 100 of them because gophers might have eaten some might not have germinated. We always overproduce like that so we can have enough and also give the abundance away. That's the no hoarding principle, basically, or the no hoarding ethic. And then setting limits on wasteful growth and overpopulation and overconsumption is kind of an ecological reality. I think about it like a petri dish. If you've got a culture introduced into a petri dish, it's going to grow and fill that space as long as there's food and space. If they run out of either, they're going to stop growing. That's just the ecological reality of things. And so as human beings, we're confronted with that as well. With the Haber-Bosch process and synthetic nitrogen a while ago, all of a sudden we have, we can produce more food, and that is a big cause of overpopulation. And with certainly globalization and people moving about and development being as it is, and this seemingly unquenchable, inexhaustible resource of fossil fuels, we are just overpopulating the planet. So we've got some real ethical questions there. So that's the permaculture ethics. And now this next slide and the next one are text heavy, and I would not normally go into this, but I thought a few people might want to geek out on permaculture principles. So we'll go into a few of them. But permaculture principles are basically something anybody can discover or name at any point in time. A principle is not something that we got, from the mountain on high. It's really a pattern that somebody can observe in an ecological or social system that you can use to add value to a design. So when you're designing a landscape or designing a business or designing anything, you can look at these principles and say, how might I see this design or this map through this lens of planned redundancy, for example. So let's just unpack a few of these here. Protracted and thoughtful observation. We like to say the best tool of the permaculture designer is the hammock, right? So when you move on to a property or into a landscape or even just walk into a room, it's nice to observe before just coming in and being really loud and imposing a design. Certainly when I walk into a party, I just want to kind of check it out for a second and see who's here. Or when I'm invited onto a property to do a design, I'm gonna, just check in. Where's north? There's the sunrise. Here's the topography. Quick site analysis. And we call that pato, protracted and thoughtful observation. Okay, the next one, stacking functions, which is to say that every element serves many functions. And that one goes hand in hand with planned redundancy, which is to say every function is served by many elements. So stacking functions, my students are really good at this at UC Santa Cruz. When they take a class, it fulfills a GE, it fulfills a requirement for their major, it's with the professor they like, and it's on the side of campus where they have other classes. All these different functions are being met all at once. When we create a pond, for example, what are some things that ponds do for you on the landscape? Attract wildlife, habitat.
Give you water.
Give you water. They catch and store water, and then you can draw from it. There's an element of fire safety there and fire suppression. If there's a fire coming and your house is on the other side of the pond, it's not going to probably cross that pond. So on and on and on. Irrigation, water, so many functions. That one element does many, many things. Okay, then let's switch to the next principle of planned redundancy and say the function of water. You need water on the landscape for your plants, for showering, for drinking. We need water for many, many things. So you've got the pond. What if the pond runs dry or the pump isn't working? You'd be out of water. Okay, so then we've got the city water hookup as a backup, really good. Maybe there's rainwater tanks to collect water. Maybe there's a creek or a stream on the property. So you've got a redundant design to fulfill the function of water. That's very important because, if you put all your eggs in one basket, you know how the story goes. So then relative location, I love this one because it's to say permaculture is not an assemblage of nouns. It's not just a bunch of cool stuff. I've got the composting toilet and I've got the pond and the greenhouse and the chickens and the garden and the food forest, like checking all these things off the list. No. It's about how they connect. It's about the verb, permaculture as a verb in the relationships between those elements so that the waste of one system can be the food of the other system. That's the idea here. And then lastly, making the least change for the greatest possible effect. So it's to look for those strategic leverage points in a system. A lot more principles. I'm not going to read them. I'm not going to go into them too much. But I will give one social example, which is in the problem lies the solution, or the problem is the solution. Sometimes people will say it that way. And you've had Pandora Thomas speak with you? Not yet? Okay, so she's a colleague and friend. She co-founded the Black Permaculture Network, lives in Berkeley. And she was looking at how many black men in particular in her community were incarcerated and then coming back and not able to re-enter in a good way, right? Not able to find a job, find housing, just resettle into being a free man and what it is to be an engaged citizen in the world with rights and with responsibilities and aspirations. And so she's like, dang, this is a problem. And then she's like, wait, so I'm gonna say this again. All these men are coming back and they don't have jobs. Wait, all these men are coming back and they don't have jobs, right? Just switching the perspective a little bit. Oh, what if we were to train them in permaculture design and in facilitation, in entrepreneurship, and they were to create the green economy and be stewards in their community doing some of the things that Sustainable Solano is doing, for example. And so they have this re-entry program where they run through a permaculture design course, a bunch of other facilitation processes, a lot of personal empowerment, and then they graduate and they feel really good about themselves and they're tooled up and they go out and create change in their communities. So the problem is the solution in some cases. It's a matter of perspective. Okay, great, moving right along. This is the permaculture flower, and I love how much it resembles your flower from Sustainable Solano. So you'll see the ethics and design principles spiraling throughout these domains, these different petals of the flower. And so permaculture is often sort of pegged as a gardening technique, and it is. Permaculture is really easy to see in the garden. There's a quote from Jeff Lawton saying, all the world's problems can be solved in a garden, and I believe that. But it's so much more than a garden technique, and this image really shows that. So yes, there's land and nature stewardship, gardening, agroforestry, tending the wild, regenerating grasslands, redwood forest, oak forest, both the garden in a fenced-in sense, but also the wider garden. Next, we've got land and nature stewardship. Building is next. So natural building. The construction trade is very destructive on the landscape. You've seen quarries, I'm sure, clear cuts for wood. A lot of greenhouse gases are produced through the production of concrete, on and on and on. But it turns out people around the world for a long, long time have been putting clay, straw, and sand together and making adobe bricks. And those buildings have been around for thousands of years in some cases. It's a little tricky in earthquake-prone California. We've got some unique challenges and opportunities. And in other places of the world, they're using, bamboo and other materials. But there's ways to build more beautiful, less toxic, and more sustainable buildings than we're currently doing. So a lot of permaculture courses will build a cob oven or a cob bench or something like that just to sort of get through the techniques and the process. And then if you get excited, you can then work with the county to do the regulatory process to actually permit a building and permit a home. A little easier up in Oregon and in Northern California than it is down here. Tools and technology. It turns out technologies are not neutral. People tend to, the dominant paradigm, I would say, in our society is that, technology is neither good nor bad, it's just how you use it that makes it good or bad. Well, maybe. I would argue that that's not true, and actually every technology has a bias that's built into it in terms of decentralizing power or centralizing power, in terms of being something that a farmer could build and maintain on their own, or something that's going to rely on external inputs for the whole life of the technology. So there's this whole field of appropriate technology that emerged in the 70s. It's a big part of permaculture design. So that could be things like the bicycle or the rocket stove, sun ovens, ways to get off of kerosene and propane and fossil fuels. Education and culture, looking at things like Waldorf school, home school, participatory action research, moving away from just top-down academic research towards more engaged research processes. And we need to have our own culture and entertainment generated in our communities, so we're not always driving to the city for our shows. What about talent shows and passion shows and dances and whatnot? I'm going to skip this one for a second. Finance and economics. There's a whole great realm of financial permaculture, and I'm fascinated by it. I have a real thing for economics because it's really the base in many ways of our society, and I would argue the base of the problems we're facing. So things like complementary currencies and time banking, alternatives to the US dollar. Again, when we put all of our eggs in one basket in terms of currency trade and we just rely on the dollar, which is now just ones and zeros anyways, it's not very resilient. In economic hardship, you want to have a diversity of ways to trade with people. So time banking is an hour-for-hour exchange, but it's not taxed. There's complementary currencies, which are tied to the dollar and are taxed, but there's incentives to use them. So, for every dollar you use or you deposit, you might get $1.20 in a local currency. On and on, so much to say there. And then land tenure and community governance, the sphere of rights and governance and decision making. So things like consensus, but also beyond consensus, and sociocracy and holacracy, and land trusts, community land trusts, and ideas around reclaiming the commons, and moving away from just privatization, but towards collective land stewardship and land ownership. Okay, and then back to health and spiritual well-being. The reason I leave that one last is because it was kind of the, I don't want to say that, it was the forgotten petal on the flower for many years. I think many permaculturists were of this sort of hyper-masculine, has to be the built world, garden, land, and kind of left out some of the more psycho-spiritual, compassionate elements of what it is to be a human and a human in society. So people said, oh, it's too metaphysical to get into well-being and spirituality in that way. It can't be permaculture if you get into metaphysics. And I understand that. We don't want to estrange people and take a certain ideology or religion or stance. And I think that's still true. At the same time, we can all agree that, I believe we can all agree that there's a psychological and spiritual element to being a human being. And certainly we want to have things like yoga and tai chi and healthy food and other ways to take care of ourselves, especially in this sort of hyperactive culture that we have here in California. So that's where that came in. All in all, the top half are the visible structures and the bottom half are the invisible structures. So when you talk about social permaculture, it's this stuff down here that we're talking about, or the invisible structures. So that is the permaculture flower and the first part of the talk. Now we're moving on to part 2, which are the examples. And this is where it really comes alive. So that's the theory, got that done. Oh, there's one part actually, I forgot. Let me give you a definition, my definition of permaculture. And I want to invite you after this talk to, when you're talking with people, if they ask you what permaculture is and what that silly talk is that you went to, give it a try. See if you can have a little definition. And here's mine. It's from Toby Hemingway, the late and great permaculture teacher who died last February, author of the best-selling book in permaculture, Gaia's Garden, which I think I saw here somewhere. Yeah, on the table there. Great book. And it's about the gardening aspect of permaculture primarily. So Toby said, permaculture is a whole systems design philosophy. Permaculture is a whole systems design philosophy or design science rooted in natural patterns and indigenous wisdom in order to create durable and resilient human settlements. So unpacking that, permaculture is a whole systems design philosophy. There's really no such thing as permaculture. It's always permaculture design. It's a design science. It's about the lenses, through which we see the world. It's whole systems, right? You see that whole flower right there. It's not just the garden, it's how everything interacts. Rooted in natural patterns, right? So looking at how water flows down the landscape and thinking, what can we learn about how to live as a human being from how water lives? What can we learn about how to be good on the landscape through looking at how the deer are on the landscape? Okay, and then looking at indigenous wisdom. Right, so looking at how the Hawaiian Ho'oponopono culture has a peacemaking tradition that has elements that are similar to the Haudenosaunee peacemaker, Iroquois Confederacy peacemaking tradition, that have elements of how, my Scottish ancestors have a peacemaking tradition, okay, there's like some universal patterns to this indigenous wisdom. And it's not trying to avoid, but also call out cultural appropriation, not trying to just take from all these elements, but when we're invited and when we're, gifted these stories that, for example, the Mohawk people came out in the 70s at the United Nations and said, we have this story to share with the world of how we went underground hundreds of years ago because it wasn't safe, but we've been holding on to our ways, and now we're back with a message to the world. There's a great book called Basic Call to Consciousness that goes into that story. When they came out to the United Nations, that's a story that they're sharing with the world, right? They want to distribute and keep alive as an oral tradition. So when things are given like that, it's good to, bring them forward when you feel moved, but also to give respect to that lineage, because there is a history of cultural appropriation. So permaculture is about looking at those cultural elements and saying, oh, wow, just like plants move around the world, cultural elements move around the world too. Like the greeting custom. Someone comes to your house, you offer them a cup of tea. That's like a universal pattern for good community. The potluck. Okay, in order to create durable and resilient human settlements. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's to design for thriving communities. Great. So now moving on to the examples. This is a great example from Portland, Oregon, an example of community governance and so much more. It's called the City Repair Project. And there's many, many ways to explain the emergence of this project. I think this image does a really good job. On the left side, you'll see a typical suburban intersection where, the only way to meet right there is if two cars collide in the center of the crossroads. Otherwise, you're pretty much not going to meet your neighbors, and people don't look too happy either. They look kind of in a rush. There's some pollution going on. It's a cartoon. But then on the right side, you see they've transformed that crossroads into a place of meeting. That vacant space that was once just for cars is now a place for weddings and birthday parties. The corners have benches and little free book libraries and 24-hour self-service hot water tea stations and free community newspapers and kiosks and kids' fun zones where the kids feel safe on the streets to come out. So these village commons, such as this intersection on the right, have been designed out of our communities very consciously. If you look in Europe, there's many, many places where there's these central parks, right? These piazzas, these piazzettas to gather. And they're pretty historic. We travel to go see them and to be in communities like this that feel a sense of civic engagement. And when sort of North and South America were being developed, in South America, they at least have the Parque Central, right? If you go to a major city throughout Latin America, you'll find in the downtown, there's a central park. There's usually a government building, usually a church, and a bunch of cafes all around the edge. And a big mango tree or something there to provide some shade. Pretty common. Central Park in New York has this too. But when westward expansion was happening in North America, the National Land Ordinance, which is basically the pattern for westward expansion, said we don't want that anymore. And so they laid the Roman grid over, which is the north, south, east, west grid system you'll see in a lot of cities. That was the pattern. Don't need the commons anymore. And the idea, it's called the Roman grid because the Romans developed it as a divide and conquer strategy so that you could have two chariots, one going north-south, one going east-west, and you could control the entire citadel just with two chariots. So it's very practically a divide and conquer strategy that has been put over the West. And here we are in the grid. We don't know that we don't know sometimes. And so City Repair's changing that, and here's what it looks like. So they have design charrettes. They get kids together. Kids love this stuff because it's like playing, dollhouse and designing. And so they get cardboard little houses and little popsicle sticks with paper and trees, and they're like, oh my God, that's my house. What I've always wanted to have is like a trampoline right here. And what if we had like a slide from the roof over to your garden and then right from there, just get really creative. Just go for it. Take down the fences. Get creative. And then they basically go out and do it. Sometimes there's permitting involved. The very first project was unpermitted. They'd been giving cookies to the local cop for years and becoming their friend, and then they had a big block party because they went to the Department of Transportation to see if they could legally do this, just painting the intersection to calm traffic, because 2 little girls had been mowed down by cars in 1 year. And they said, we have to stop traffic on Tacoma Street. And the Department of Transportation said, no, you can't. This is a road, and it's the public road, so nobody can use it. They're like, wait, the public road, so nobody can use it? That doesn't make sense. This is our street. You mean after paying a mortgage for 30, 40 years here, we don't own the little planting strip in front of our house? This is not going to stand. So they called the neighbors, they had a town meeting, everyone wanted to do this. They called a block party, shut down the streets, and overnight they did it. They just made it happen. They all crossed the line together, and then within a matter of weeks to months, the county and city code had changed. And now there's, I think, something like 30 different legal structures in place to allow this sort of construction to happen. And by this construction, I mean all of this, not just the painting of the intersection, but small natural building projects like benches that are covered. How beautiful is that? Don't you want to live in a world that's more round and you can touch and smell the earth more, and it's got the hot water tea station. I had tea there a couple months ago when I was in Oregon. It's still there. They repaint the intersection every year to keep the oral history alive. The teenage boys that were once the hoodlums of the neighborhood that would vandalize this stuff, they painted it, so it's their turf. They reclaim that space, and they're the protectors of this space now. So their trouble is painting stuff. And then they've got tons of big bike parties all over the place, hot tubs and saunas and natural building and on. And that's Mark Lakeman, who's I want to cite as one of the founders, or maybe we could say finder of this. It probably found him as much as he found it. But Mark Lakeman in Portland, Oregon. Okay, another example. The water retention landscape of Tamara. So Tamara's full name is Tamara Healing Biotope 1 in Portugal. It was an intentional community in Germany that wanted to buy a larger tract of land, and they looked around and found this place in Portugal. It was a desert. It is a desert. That whole region, very dry. Been in agriculture for hundreds of years, slowly degrading over time, till it looked like this, right? And they had a plan when they got the land, and I want to invite you also, if you're thinking about buying a property, and especially if you're going to farm it, and you need to make money off of the farm, not just a gentleman or gentlewoman or gentle person farmer, but actually need to make money, I'd advise you to have a plan before you put the money down on the property. And hit the ground running, so to speak, and they did. So they hired Sepp Holzer, the permaculture designer, to design a water retention landscape, and we're going to get into that a little bit more later. I think, Nicole, you're going to follow up and talk about the food forestry and the swales and water harvesting. But this is what it looks like on a larger scale. So just through modifying the geography and the landscape and doing a little bit of earth moving with some heavy machinery, moving some dirt up, moving some dirt down, packing some clay on the bottom to make it less pervious. They have turned this into a year-round, green, cool, wet landscape with fruit trees and food and everything. And that's just the rainwater, right? There's not a well feeding that right there. That's just taking what is given and storing it, and then slowly releasing it out over the year. It's a very inspiring story. They do a lot here around peace and peacemaking as well. It's a great intentional community, but there's a video called Water is Life if you want to see the story of how this was made. Very inspiring. On a smaller scale, on a more home, backyard, Fairfield scale, Santa Cruz scale, we've got berms and swales. So berms and swales are, or let's say a swale is an on-contour ditch. So on-contour means it's level. If you were to put water in the basin, it would, be level the whole way across, not draining, but just like a pool. And then you take that soil from the ditch and you pile it up next to it, and that's called the berm. So basically what they've created here is they've dug out the swale and taken that soil and piled it up here to create this berm, which becomes a really nice planting surface. This is a Berms swale in progress. It's not going to look like this, once they're done for the day. But you'll see, this is the grade, then it goes down. You could fill that with wood chips. You could, fill that with stones and turn that into a pathway, or you could leave it, that's fine. In some cases, if you have water-loving plants, you can plant the swale. If you're in a really dry, arid climate, that might be where you plant. In fact, at our farm at UC Santa Cruz, we're planting corn in the furrow, right? So certain crops can tolerate being a little bit wetter, might need a little bit more water. And then things that don't like to have their feet wet, trees that don't want to be in standing water in the wintertime, for example. Pears can tolerate having their feet wet over the winter, but like cherries and apricots and stuff like that, they're not going to really appreciate that. So you plant them on the berm. They're lifted up a little bit. Every winter, when it rains, that fills up, the water recharges. You could, plumb your laundry machine to a swale, and it's kind of like a French drain, basically, where the water will just fill the swale and recharge right there. And underground, every year, a lens of water is growing. Every year, as you get 20, 30, 40, 100 inches last winter in the Santa Cruz Mountains, it's recharging the groundwater to the point where that aquifer is getting recharged, and then the water table is rising, right? So this disk of water is growing underground and then, sinking into the aquifer, and that's also rising. So you'll see, I'm going to go back one slide, you'll see it's not just the area like immediately at the pond's edge, it's the landscape way up here too, because it's affecting the larger hydrology. Isn't that so amazing? We can reverse drought. The California drought is a human-designed problem. We have designed this problem by having impervious surface with a downspout that goes to a storm drain right out to the ocean where it turns into salt water. That's the exact opposite of what we need. We need that water to hit. Sure, it might hit an impervious surface, but eventually it needs to hit a pervious landscape where it can slow down and spread out and sink into the groundwater. Okay, next example is this notion of forest gardening or food forestry, which I know Nicole's also going to get into more detail about, and I hope you'll all sign up and create food forests in your backyard. They're super fun, they're beautiful, they're really easy to maintain. You've got so much help. It's really impressive what's happening here, so I hope you all sign up. But it's growing like the forest, not growing in the forest necessarily. You don't have to have a big redwood in your backyard to do forest gardening or a whole orchard yet. You can start with a blank slate. So what we're doing is we're speeding up succession. Does anybody know the term succession? Is that a new term? Okay, so succession, if you think about a forest that is clear-cut, or there's a landslide or an earthquake and everything gets mixed up, and you're reset and there's like no trees and grasses, it's just like mixed up dirt. That's the earliest stage of succession after a disturbance. Then slowly over time you get some grasses and annual plants coming in, and then you get some low-growing shrubs, and then maybe a tree can come in, and then eventually you have, back to sort of an old-growth climax state. Not all ecosystems turn into forests. There are old-growth grasslands as well, but it turns into that later stage of a mature ecosystem. And then a disturbance happens, and it resets all the way back there. Turns out as time moves on, the diversity of the ecosystem will increase, and as a disturbance happens, it decreases. So we could just let all of our lawns go and just slowly let them evolve, and different, plants will come in for a couple decades and then a shrub, or we can speed it up and just design with a tall tree, a small tree, a shrub, something at the herbaceous level, maybe something in the root zone, some vining plants, maybe some ground covers, some fungal layer with mushrooms. I love this image because somebody took the 7-level beneficial guild of the forest garden, which is a really classic image, and they're like, mushrooms, the mycelial layer, and they added in number 8 and put that in. I love that. Right, there's that anarchist tradition of permaculture. But again, you've got the canopy, large fruit and nut tree layer. So you might have a chestnut. I mean, if you have a big backyard in Fairfield, you could have a chestnut. It's large. You might already have an oak tree also. There might be something there already. Providing habitat, providing food. If it's an oak forest, but you don't have an oak tree, you might choose a species that's related to oak as an analog. If you didn't want to plant an oak and you don't really like making, acorn pancakes, you could choose something, related like that. 2 would be the low tree layer, like a dwarf fruit tree, apple, peach, pear, fig. Shrub layer, lavender, salvias, things like that. Currants, raspberries. Herbaceous layer. Herbaceous plants are ones that grow in the growing season, spring, summer, fall, and then die back in the wintertime. So things like comfrey, things like, I already said raspberry, beets, they say, other vegetables. The rhizosphere, the root vegetables, oca, sunchoke, beets, carrots, etc. The soil surface ground covers like strawberries and creeping thyme and creeping chamomile. The vertical layer, we don't typically like to use our trees as trellises, but you can build a trellis and go vertical, and then the mycelial layer, like I said. So that's all well and good in theory. They tend to look a lot like this, which looks beautiful, right? I mean, that looks like the Garden of Eden. You've got citrus trees and lavenders and various flowering salvias, rosemary, art in the garden, a rose plant, another salvia down here, comfrey. There are many, many ecosystem services being fed here. Water retention, carbon sequestration, providing year-round habitat for beneficial insects, not to mention mammals. And you can design, which mammals you want to attract and which ones you don't, to some extent. A garden like this, it might attract some rodents. It might provide habitat for them. So you get to deal with issues like that and design for that. Again, the problem is the solution. Do you have a rat abundance, or do you have a cat shortage? Right? Think about it. What's really happening there? But all in all, this is capturing more sunlight and water than if it was a monoculture. In agroecology, which is a complementary field with permaculture, we talk about the light equivalency ratio, where if you take just a field of corn, or in our course we did broccoli, just a field of broccoli, and look at how much you can produce and what the market value is of it and all that jazz. And then you take that same field of broccoli, and instead of being a monoculture, you interplant lettuce at different densities, right? 1 broccoli, 2 lettuce, 1 broccoli, 1 lettuce, like that. And then you look at the yield, and then look at the market value of that yield. You make more money and grow more food when you interplant, as a general statement. I'm sure not all interplantings work like that, but certainly that one did. And another classic example is corns, beans, and squash, right? The milpa or three sisters, grown everywhere throughout the Americas and now elsewhere as well. You grow more food and can make more money as a farmer in that way. And this takes that concept and really expands on it, especially with perennial plants. So here's another version of edible forest garden or food forest. This is my mentor, Orrin Martin. I want to give a little shout out from UC Santa Cruz. He's been teaching farmers for 40 years out of a place called the Allen Chadwick Garden, which is a 50-year-old food forest, one of the first organic gardens in the United States, started in 1965. And it's got some rows. That last garden was just kind of free-flowing and maybe on contour. This is not on contour. This is actually off contour by design, but we don't have erosion problems. But you've got a row of trees and then an alley crop, and that looks like lettuce right there. That apple tree here is probably too big now to have a vegetable crop underneath. But when it was young, I bet for the first 3 or 4 years, it had, in the wintertime, a huge crop of garlic. And then when the tree was young, even in the summertime, we probably had peppers underneath it. And so we're growing crops under the trees for many, many years. And then once they're full size, we'll stop. The trees will be there for 10 years, and then we'll actually take those trees out and plant more trees elsewhere, because we need to teach students how to plant trees. So that means sometimes you have to take out trees. But there's many different ways to do this interplanting. Okay, another example moving around the permaculture flower is financial permaculture. So as I said, I'm really fascinated by the economy and see it as one of those leverage points for change today. Who's heard of Winona LaDuke? Anybody? Miss Magazine gave her the Woman of the Year award about 10, 15 years ago, I believe. She ran with Ralph Nader under the Green Party ticket for Vice President of the United States. She's a Native American woman, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and I got to study with her in England at the Schumacher College, which is like a center for sustainability and alternative economics. And she said a quote that I've never forgotten: "You're either at the table or on the menu." You're either at the table or you're on the menu, which means there's decisions being made every day about our lives. Do we want to be engaged in those conversations and have a seat at the table? And if we're not, we're on somebody else's agenda. We're on somebody else's menu. So yeah, there's economic plans for how the middle class and lower class and upper class are meant to be in America. I don't like those plans. I want to do something different, actually. So we're working on it. And there are some low-hanging fruits, and then there's some bigger things. Bigger fish to fry, not the right analogy. Bigger problems to find the solution in. So complementary currencies, that's a really great example, which are alternatives to the US dollar. As I said earlier, it's not a very resilient design to just have all our eggs in one basket and just use the almighty dollar for everything, whether it's credit cards or cash. And so there's many communities. There's the Ithaca Hours in Ithaca, New York. There's the Berkshires around Boston, Western Massachusetts, actually. And then locally, we have the Baybucks, which is new. I am really excited to plug in with these folks. We had a complementary currency thing starting in Santa Cruz, and when I spoke with the founders of it a couple years ago, they said they're not doing it anymore because we got Baybucks now. So we're working on a more regional scale. And instead of explaining it myself, I thought I would just hit the play button. Unfortunately, we couldn't figure out the audio, so if you're in the back, I want to encourage you to come closer.
How does the Baybucks Business Trade Exchange work, and how will it help my business? Is your cash flow tied up in extra inventory? Do you have idle capacity or unbilled hours expiring worthlessly? Are you discounting prices in the hopes that the economy will somehow turn around? Across the Bay Area, many local businesses are struggling with these same problems. Unsold items and extra capacity often cost them money. They steeply discount their inventory while costs continue to rise. But what if there was a way for all these local businesses to collaborate, form a network, and trade the things they have for the things they need? Baybucks brings together local businesses and helps them to do just that. Turn their excess inventory or time into an asset. When you use Baybucks, you are no longer constrained by the lack of cash. A business earns Baybucks when they sell their own goods or services to another member business. They can then use the Baybucks they earn to buy from any other business on the network. They do not need to buy from the business that purchased from them. Baybucks helps improve your cash flow, brings you new customers, additional business, and improves your profit margin, all while helping other local businesses just like yours.
Yay! Baybucks. Cool.
Kind of like the barter system, but you can use it with different businesses, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Oh, okay. We're doing this now, are we? So it is a dollar for dollar exchange. You take $10, you go to the Bay Bucks, and then you get 10 Bay Bucks. And I'm not going to get into the details because we have other material to cover, and also I don't want to do it injustice. But essentially, that video was for business owners, not for consumers. So it was kind of geared in that direction. There is the basic concept that people have in their business. They are not necessarily working at full capacity all the time, or might have inventory that's just sitting there. And with inventory and supplies and manufacturing, you make your money by moving them and creating more. So you want to get rid of it and make some more and reproduce. So Bay Bucks is a way to incentivize people to take that extra inventory and extra time and use that in the Bay Bucks system. So you're not taking away from your cash economy stuff. That's still a part of your business. But with that extra inventory, you can move it. That's the basic concept here. In some cases, you literally go to the bank. I think Ithaca works like this. You go to the Ithaca Hours Bank, you give them $1, you get $1.10 in Ithaca Hours. Because there's this, I forget what it's called, there's this factor where when you spend money locally, it has a multiplier effect, is what it's called. Where just the money circulating creates wealth in your community. And the opposite's true, where when you spend $1 at a store that's sending that money out of the community, we're impoverishing our community. Hence, buying local being such a good thing. It's really powerful. I'm not saying it's going to change all the world's problems just to localize everything, but wow, a lot of the problems we're facing have to do with globalization and economic globalization. And when we turn towards the local, we can have a lot of power and solutions. Another example, as I said, was time banking, which is an hour-for-hour exchange. It builds community. A hazard around time banking is sometimes it tends to be, light services and not really getting into surgery and ambulances and things like that. So it's not going to replace everything, but there's a lot of community that can be built through time banking. And a lot of good projects can happen, especially intergenerational collaboration and real friendship forming. Let's face it, folks, in America and in California, we're largely isolated from one another. And I don't know about you, I'm a community-oriented guy, really social, but I still want to meet people. I still want to meet strangers, especially across difference, especially across class, race, age, nationality, all sorts of differences. So any system that can help facilitate those exchanges, I think, is a good one. Another thing, kind of going big picture, is to look at alternative indicators like the Gross National Happiness Project in Bhutan. Right? Here we have the gross domestic product as our economic indicator. In Bhutan, they've developed a way to measure the economic activity in a much more holistic way with many different pillars and indicators, not just how much money you make and how much you spend. We are offering a new certificate program through Santa Cruz Permaculture next year that is a certificate through the E.F. Schumacher College in England that we are offering locally. It's a year-long program. We might shrink it to 9 or 6 months to work with some leading scholars in alternative economics and hear some lectures and get inspired, and then to do real on-the-ground projects in the Bay Area, creating small businesses, but also moving this alternative sharing gift economy forward through on-the-grounds projects. So if you're interested, you can sign up in the back, and I'll send you more information when it launches next year. Okay, another example, tools and technology. This is Aprovecho Research Center in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and they have the Burn Lab where they're affiliated with the Burn Lab, I forget. But in any case, they research cook stoves. Turns out many people in the world cook by fire still and really prefer it as the main cooking method. Get to sit around the fire. There's a real culture about it. I don't know about you, but I love cooking over a fire. And so they're looking at what are the most efficient ways to do that? What are the smoke-free fires, that are healthier in the kitchen? How do we get the most energy from the wood to the pot, to what we're cooking with as little smoke as possible. So one technology is the rocket stove. This is a J stove, where it's got a really tall chimney and this upward facing firebox. And they're using kindling right here instead of big logs, and it produces a lot of heat. They've even commercialized it and made these. I'm sorry, the contrast isn't very good, but that's basically a tin can. You know the big coffee tins, the number 10 size, like Folgers cans? You can get them from any food service provider. If you go to a dining hall at a university and look in their recycling, they're just gonna be full of those cans. You can cut them up and put them together and make a really fuel efficient backyard stove. And I'm just saying, it's good to have these around, because there are many places in the world where rolling blackouts are already a thing. I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember this. I certainly am not, but the Arab oil embargo, right, when it was hard to get gasoline for a little while in America, that's happening in many places in the world. And so do we want to wait till that happens to have a backup? It's like, your disaster preparedness kit. Or might we just have it now and just use it now, as if we wanted to get off of fossil fuels and dethrottle now instead of later? It'll be easier to do that now when we have the resources. So definitely keep a rocket stove in your disaster preparedness kit. It's a good thing to have. This next slide is a cob bench. It's a radiant heating bench that I helped build at my friend John Young's place in Bonnie Doon in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so here's where the wood goes in, and then the fire goes down into a tube around this bench through a tube up here and then around and out this chimney. And by the time it comes out, it's not that hot and there's no smoke. So this house, on the other side of the living room, there's a standard, fireplace like that. And it's a huge room with a high ceiling and a staircase that goes upstairs. And Bonnie Doon gets cold in the wintertime. A lot of frosty mornings. And we would throw cords and cords of oak and madrone and really good dry wood in there to have a fire, and it would never heat the house. It was always cold. The heat just went right up to the roof, and then the fan would hit it and it'd go up the staircase, and it was never warm. And so we built this, and it's a radiant heater where, because the heat goes through here and then back out, and because this bench is cob, it's earthen, and it's got all these nice river rocks down here, it sucks up that heat and holds onto it and radiates it out through the night. So this thing's just like a big furnace all night long. You just lie down on it and you just want to go right to bed. We had it covered in sheep skins and really like nice, soft, fuzzy things. But now we're using kindling, literally little twigs, and it's heating the whole house pretty much. I mean, that whole immediate area, where we were using cords of wood and it wasn't working. So having the right tool makes a big, big difference.
Who designed that?
That was Ernie and Erica, who learned with Yonto Evans. Yeah, Rocket Mass Heaters is a book that actually I think has that photo in it. Rocket Mass Heaters. Okay, so natural building. That was natural building too, but here's another example of a building. This is Linda Evans's house from the Cobb Cottage Company, also in Oregon. And she wanted to demonstrate the feasibility of a mortgage-free starter cob home. That cost $10,000. A couple without construction experience can build this for under $10,000 in 1 year. It's not the biggest house. There's other examples, but she wanted to show, what could be possible. Living roof, beautiful, right? Smells good. Cement buildings like the UC Santa Cruz Library where I work, they off-gas for like decades. The cement smells really bad. This smells like dirt. It smells good, It's very cool on a hot day. It's very warm on a cold day. Very insulating. And I mean, they're not all linear. They're round. And there are buildings in Devon, England, and very cold and wet parts of the world that are hundreds of years old, right? So people always say, oh, cob is going to rot. Well, if you actually build it with a nice overhang and you make sure that the wall can breathe, because it can get wet, the wind can come sideways, but then it also gets dry, right? It also wicks out the water. That's a very important thing. You know, in Oregon, if you have a house in the woods in the shade and you're not in it for a long time and no one's there to like keep a fire going, things will mold. And that'll still happen here. You still have to be there and tend to it. It's not solving all the world's problems, but it certainly is adequate as a normal house would be. Okay, moving around the permaculture flower now to broad acre, broad scale permaculture, thinking big picture. Because a lot of times people think permaculture is just a city folks thing, just for us city folks to, you know, solve the urban problems. It is that, but it's also looking at larger ecosystems. So there's a farmer up the coast from Santa Cruz, Donegal Markegard grass-fed beef. There's also Sally Calhoun down in Piscines. Donegal has land up here in Sonoma and Marin up here-ish. And they're doing what's called holistic management, which is grazing cattle in a very different way than we're used to. And who's seen the film Cowspiracy or any of the films that are very sort of anti-industrial meat agriculture? There's a good reason to be anti-industrial meat agriculture, animal agriculture. It's basically caused this all over the world. It's one of the leading causes of desertification worldwide. And so what has happened is on the rangelands of the Midwest, for example, a big fence will get put up over, 1,000 acres, let's just say, and cattle will be brought in, and they'll forage that whole area, and they'll eat their first favorite foods, and then, they're just going around trampling it, eating their first favorite foods, and then they're gone, and then they find their second favorite foods, and they're eating all them, and while they're eating their second favorite foods, the first ones are growing back, and then they go back and find those and eat those, and then the second favorite foods, and then they're on to their third favorite foods, and the first ones, they're gone now. They're not coming back because they've eaten them and trampled them. They didn't regenerate. And then their second favorite foods, and then they're gone, and then they're on to their third, and then it's like that. Okay, that's an artificial system that we created by fencing them in and also removing their predators, right? Because these herd animals, they have a herd mentality. They want to stick together for safety, and they'll move around as the predator's moving them around, right? The wolf, for example. So when we remove the predators and fence them in, they can't do that anymore. We've put them in these artificial systems. So holistic management is where we actually have that 1,000-acre parcel and break it up into smaller paddocks, maybe 100 acres, maybe even 10. So you have a high density of animals, of herd animals, but they move around really quickly. So under that same example, they're in that 100-acre or 10-acre parcel. They eat their first favorite foods, and they pee and poo all over everything, and they trample it up and disturb it. But then they move on to the next paddock. And so that other one is regenerating, and it got fertilized and peed on, it got irrigated, It's not only regenerating, it's regenerating really well. It's actually, been fertilized. And then they move on, and they move on, they move on, they move on. And by the time they get back around, it's green and lush again. Okay, that's the ideal in California where it wasn't really denuded to begin with. But you can start in a desert and do that too. The stocking density is going to be a little bit less. The time period is going to be a little bit longer. You're going to have to bring in some supplemental feed, more supplemental feed. But we start to see that process of succession. Annuals, packed cover, perennials coming back, right? This is the same space, right? The same trees getting greener. Water is starting to infiltrate into the landscape instead of just sheeting off because the ground's been disturbed more. And there's plant cover. So a lot to say there, but it's reversing desertification all over the world. It's restoring grasslands. It's sequestering carbon. It's providing livelihoods for people. It's treating animals more humanely. I think the idea of being a vegan or a vegetarian is certainly a beautiful thing. If you have an ethical reason that you do not want to partake in the slaughter or the eating of another animal, nothing to argue with. Why would I take a case against that ethical decision? But to say that all animal agriculture is bad and produces greenhouse gases is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that's an issue I take with that film Cowspiracy, where when they get to holistic management, they cite a bad mistake that Alan Savory, the developer of this method, made, where he was actually in Africa looking at how to regenerate an ecosystem down there, and the elephants were actually denuding the landscape because there were so many of them. And so he made a decision that was really common at the time to cull a lot of elephants, and it didn't help the landscape regenerate. And he felt really bad about it. And in Cowspiracy, they get to that point, they're like, this guy killed a bunch of elephants, so he obviously doesn't matter at all. I'm like, wait, they didn't even look at the main body of work that he's doing, which is so fantastic. So this is very controversial, I just want to say. But having been to many of these farms, it seems to be working. Seems to be that their ranches have more water on them year-round than the cattle ranches right next to them that don't look so good. Okay, another example of broadacre permaculture is looking at forest regeneration. This is sudden oak life. Who's heard of sudden oak death, right? Phytophthora ramorum killing our oak forests. There are ways to mimic traditional ecological knowledge to regenerate oak trees. So instead of using fire to remove the understory competition under the oak trees, to burn the mosses and lichens that are acidifying the trees and weakening the tree's immune system, and the fire would also remineralize the soil. Instead of doing that, we can go in and with loppers just take out the weeds. And with brushes in our hands and blowtorches even, burn and scrape away the mosses and lichens that are acidifying the trees. And use oyster shell powder to remineralize the soil. Really simple techniques. It'd be great to just use fire, don't get me wrong. But for air quality issues, that's a little challenging. And also for fire safety issues, that's a little challenging. We've let our fuel loads build up so much in our forests that when fire comes in, it tends to be a really catastrophic fire. So what we have in Big Sur after the big fire down there and other places is a real opportunity to keep the fuel load low. Now that the catastrophic fires come in and things are regenerating, right? Remember that first image of the degenerative, sustainable, and regenerative? We have an opportunity right now after that catastrophe to keep the fuel load low and let that forest get back to what it once was instead of just letting the fuel load build up. When we suppress fire completely, bad things happen. We have to have some amount of fire because it's either going to come as a catastrophic fire once in a long time, or we're going to have many mini fires that keep things pretty safe. So, I mean, look, 2013, drought happened, 2015, right? That oak tree is healthier than beforehand, even during the drought times. And he's got hundreds of these slides. So Lee Klinger is his name, if you want to check out Sudden Oak Life. So we're moving into the last section of this talk. And you'll see back to the permaculture flower, this is another version of it. There's those different domains, and there's the home scale, the community scale, and the bioregional scale. Different techniques at every scale in every dimension to create change in the world and build a global social movement. So here we're going to go big picture just to wrap things up. And this is a theory not from permaculture, but actually from Rudolf Steiner. So who's heard of Waldorf schools or biodynamic agriculture? Did you go to a Waldorf school? Okay. Did anyone else go to a Waldorf school? I wish I did. So in Waldorf education, we talk about educating the whole human and the head, the heart, and the hands. Right? Head, heart, hands. So this is a theory for the head, heart, and hands of society. So you've got the head in the political sphere, the heart in the cultural sphere, and the hands in the economic sphere. The political sphere is represented by governments, by legal structures, lawyers. It's the sphere of rights. Culture is represented by civil society organizations, churches, universities, and basically people when they're just being people. We all are born into the cultural sphere by the fact that we are born into a family, and then we have peers and an education system. And we just learn as humans. So we're all definitely in this sphere. You enter this sphere when you decide to run for political office or engage as a lawyer, like that. You can apply pressure on the political system from the outside without actually becoming an actor in it. The economic sphere is represented by businesses and the market, so to speak. And then we've, of course, can't forget we're embedded in the natural world. And Steiner would also put spirit up here as well. So I want to credit Rudolf Steiner and also Nicanor Perlas, who is coming to Los Angeles next week. He ran for the presidency of the Philippines in 2010, lost because there's massive voter fraud over there and elsewhere in the world. But he's coming to LA to do a class on social threefolding and cultural revolution next week. And if you're interested, you can talk with me. It's called How We Will Forum, F-O-R-U-M, How We Will Form the Cultural Revolution. Okay, so a little history lesson. You might already know this stuff, but we'll get into this in a second. Don't get too confused by it. So World War II happened, right? And then there's the bombing of Europe, Japan, there's this whole rebuilding effort. The US has emerged as a superpower. And there's this set of agreements that was made at Bretton Woods that created and sort of paved the way for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to help finance the rebuilding. And then trade agreements, namely the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs that later segued into the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. And that really set the agenda for neoliberalism, for global capitalism, and set the United States as the boss, as the sort of decision makers. But it wasn't the United States government, it was these trade agreements. But they were US-backed trade agreements that had the US interest in mind. So the Bretton Woods agreements happened. And then for many decades, there's been a back and forth between the governments of nation states and these global political agreements and actors saying, we run the world and decide what's going to happen with financial markets and sovereignty, because we have these big trade agreements and they don't see borders and boundaries. They're just global agreements for all of the world. On the other side, people in the political sphere saying, that doesn't work for me. We are the nation of Argentina. We have sovereignty in our land. We decide what tariffs there are and what big loans we're going to take for redevelopment projects and what structural adjustment programs we will or will not engage in. So there's been a real back and forth like that. Who gets to decide what happens? Is it governments that have rights, or is it these global trade agreements? Long story short, the global trade agreements have won. They've mostly won. Case after case after case, these big multilateral and multinational corporations have won. Then in 1999 in Seattle, you might have heard of the Battle of Seattle. There's a massive global rally, global justice rally or anti-globalization rally that said, hey, what about culture? What about civil society? The labor movement, the women's movement, indigenous peoples movement, environmental movement, all these people from various social movements came together and said no. No to that and yes to this. And so what has happened is now explained here. So under capitalist society, it's all about the almighty dollar. Corporate economy runs things and tells culture how to be. We see very materialistic, hedonistic culture tells the government how to run, puts officials into seats of power, dictatorship, fascism, etc., democracies failing around the world, and forcing different ways of being on the individual and denying the spirit. Okay, sounds familiar, sounds bad. And then on the flip side, and this is also not exactly where we want to be, I would say. We want to be equal in these three spheres. But with the Battle of Seattle, people say, okay, culture. Culture is the birthplace that then provides legitimacy to the rights and governance sphere and delegitimizes, right? If you think there's a delegitimate government, culture is the place to say that from. Then can also provide incentives and boycotts to the economy right there, to good and bad businesses. And it's individuals that act through culture that then act through to provide boycotts or incentives or legitimacy or delegitimacy. Or you can just decide to run for political office. Or you can just decide to run a business directly. And of course, we're embedded in the natural world and the spirit moving through all things. So, probably too small to read, but this is a sense of what that sustainable development agenda could look like globally. And Nicanor Perlas got the Alternative Nobel Prize for having a sustainable development agenda in the Philippines called PA21. And it's really about leveraging and synergizing the unique gifts of each of these three spheres. So I think Sustainable Solano is a really good example of this, right? It's a cultural organization that works with government officials and local businesses to get things done. I think that's a really good recipe, so I applaud you for your efforts and your design. And the last slide I wanted to give was just to say, so we need to protect culture. Culture is being preyed upon. Non-government organizations, people, free spaces for free speech and free thought are being preyed upon. We need to, if we're going to build a wall, let's build a safe place for people to think for themselves and communities to gather and organize for civil society. And that civil society, those individuals can mobilize to change the system, just provide alternatives, such as we're doing with permaculture, just show things that work and build them, and also countervail and apply pressure and say no. But then also building green businesses, right? And also, again, providing boycotts for things that we don't believe in. And then running for office and, city, county, state, federal office in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. But also withholding legitimacy, as I've said, to really say, nope, that's not legitimate. They don't have rights. We have rights. And introducing new politics, ultimately. Okay, so I want to end by just saying thank you. We have a permaculture design course in Santa Cruz coming up that starts on the 30th of September. If you're interested, a number of the people whose slides I've referred to are in the course. It's 6 months. You can come camp with me. If you want more information, there's a table in the back. And there's all of our contact info. Thank you very much.